go back in the leadership track, and I have now the pleasure to introduce you to Almantas Karpavicius. I hope I have pronounced it correctly. We have tried it, but I don't know if it worked correctly now. So, Almantas is the lead and software engineer at TransUnion, and his great passion is TDD and BDD. But he also loves to teach others and changing ideas. So, this passion is the reason why he has founded an international community and has now over 7,000 members. And he also created and conducted 2 bootcamps for backend developers. And he told me that he is always searching for ways to improve and share. And I think this is interesting in our fast moving world today. Today, he will share insights how BDD can help to have better documentation so that we don't run in a situation to find old documentations which are not helpful anymore. But for you, don't forget, rate sessions, leave comments, and ask Q&A questions so that you can win one of the free ebooks sponsored by our knowledge partner, Pact and Many. Almantas, now it's your stage. And
Thank you. Thank you for a nice introduction. So today, as mentioned, I'll talk about BDD. It's more, and I'll try to say, why is it more than just a way of testing? Why is it more than just a different kind of tests? So once again, a little bit about myself. As mentioned, I'm lead software engineer at TransUnion, and I love mentoring people at work. I founded C# Discord community with over 7,000 members. I've made roughly 100 videos on YouTube about programming, and I created 2 C# bootcamps for backend developers. I've been nominated Microsoft MVP for that, and recently I also released a book called C# Workshop. So why BDD? What are you going to see in this presentation? It's not going to be just a presentation on how to do it, how to write tests, how to test, but it's going to be a presentation about something that we do on almost a daily basis, collaborating, working on creating clear, understandable user stories, and designing our tests to be on point, specific, and without the need of explaining the explanation from the author how the test works. Self-explanatory tests, how to design that, and how to collaborate, how to use collaboration, how to use those tests to inspire and drive collaboration as well. And of course, you may or may not have heard about BDD, but I'll try to bust some myths, what it's good for and what it's not so good for. And all of this will be based on, a lot of this will be based on eShop testing, shopping cart functionality, changing quantity of shopping cart items. This book, other than my personal experience, which I have worked on BDD for, I think I started 3 years ago, so I've worked with BDD on several projects, and I've also read a few books about it, and the 2 that are here on your screen left quite an impression on me. So the presentation is going to be heavily influenced by them. And also there is a SpecFlow, a tool for .NET developers to write feature tests, and it has a ton of great examples and tips of how to do it well. So it's also based on that. So what is BDD and what do most people get wrong about it? So a feature in BDD is written in Gherkin language, and Gherkin language may sound intimidating, but it really comes down to 5 or so keywords. So feature is a test suite, scenario is a test case, given is a precondition, when is your act, your interaction with system on the test, and then is an assertion. What do you expect? So every test case is made of usually 3 or at least 2 keywords. So given, when, then. And here you can see the first example. As Osha the shopper, I would like to change quantity of shopping cart products so that I can choose how many items I want to buy without going to a shop. So we say that before all tests, to change shopping cart product quantity, we need to have at least one item. So we need the cart to contain an item, and then we work with that item. We say in precondition, if we want to decrement it, it needs to be at least 2. And when OSHA decrements product quantity, it should be decremented. It should work. So that's the test, and it's crystal clear, and anyone, even a non-developer, non-tester, should be able to read this. And how does this come down to on paper? How is it executed? So a feature file, the one that you saw in the previous slide, is written in using any kind of keywords that you want, as long as you use those 5 keywords to just give it a little start. And then the rest can be anything. So product quantity is at least 2 is not a part of Gherkin language. It's something that you made up, and it can be any kind of sentence that you want to write there. And it will work because there is code behind that binds to this written sentence in human language. So human language sentence binds to a underlying code. So at the top you see given product quantity is at least 2, and at the bottom you see the code that is executed. So we call shopping cart component, and we set product quantity to the one we expect. It's pretty straightforward. So the top one is going to be written by a tester, a developer, or both. And the bottom one is usually written either by automation tester or a developer. Usually a developer in my experience. So a feature, key point in a feature is that it should be examples driven. And when you have a feature with examples that are clear and understandable, you basically document functionality in that way. And that functionality documented with examples is also tests. And since it tests, it's in sync with code. It verifies the code. It shows examples for. So it's documentation that's in sync with code. And that idea in itself is great. However, when people write feature tests, they forget the main thing, that it should be documentation first and test second, automated test second. So these features end up being technical with many test cases in one scenario and not really great. So what problems are here? You can see here I don't know who I is. Then you say item quantity label, which is also very technical. It should be just item quantity and not a label. It shouldn't talk about boxes or labels. It should talk about in domain terms what it is without going too technical. So technical is easy to automate, but it's hard to read, and you should avoid that. It's not just a tool for automation. It's a lot more than that. And in the next slides, we will go through the main pillars of how to do BDD well. So BDD, other than a tool or methodology which puts a lot of emphasis on self-explanatory documentation is also a methodology to increase collaboration. And it's made of 3 pillars: discovery, formulation, and automation. And I actually found about those pillars by reading the books. Previously, I was using BDD, but I was oblivious completely to the existence of these pillars. But after reading about them, it made a lot of sense and changed the way I think about feature tests. Discovery is how do you increase understanding during refinement sessions when giving examples? It's the pillar around that. Formulation is how do you take stories refined with examples and make feature files of them? How do you take those examples and make formal features out of them? And the last one is automation. How do you take feature files and write glue code? How do you make the feature files, the documentation, in sync with code it tests? So basically, only the third pillar, automation, is about automated tests. So it's just a third of BDD. If you don't have the first 2 pillars, you don't really have BDD as well. So we need to pay attention to all 3 equally. And if you would like to see how this BDD and TDD work, you should analyze this diagram. So ideally, what should happen is before a developer writes a feature, before a developer implements a feature, a tester and developer should create a test for that, end-to-end feature test, a scenario, ideally with glue code. And that scenario would fail because it doesn't test anything. That functionality doesn't exist yet. The next step would be a developer picks a piece of work up and tries to run the feature test. It fails because there's nothing there. So they first write a unit test. It fails because there is no code yet. The developer then adds code. The test may pass or fail. If it passes, the developer adds more tests, more code. And after every run, developer also reruns feature tests to see, okay, so is it finally working? Do I have enough written to make the feature test pass? And after all unit tests pass, the developer runs feature tests. And if finally feature tests pass, they're good and they're ready to ship. So the key point here is that we write tests before implementing, and we write tests very early on. So let's focus on the first pillar, which is discovery of user stories using examples. And what is the best way to present theory? The best way to present theory is by giving examples. How can that theory be applied in practice? So when we have user stories, to understand them the best, it would be nice to support those user stories with examples, because often they're just either very technical or very much like a tale. There's a lot of information, justification, but it doesn't often have enough examples for it to be understood. And a story may start like this, where you have, as I said, just some background, some stream of thoughts that a product owner put in a user story, and such story is considered unrefined, mainly because how do we know the story is done? It's missing acceptance criteria. And stories without acceptance criteria we then need to think, okay, how do we implement them? What will we expect there to appear after the story is done? What will change? And the problem is sometimes we focus too much on the technical details rather than on the value that the story would give. So in this example, you see a story refined in a technical way. What's technical with the story? It does say why and what a user would like. A user would like to be able to change quantity of shopping cart items so that they can choose how many items they want to add without going back to a shop. Going back and forth from shop to shopping cart just to change items isn't convenient. So that's the story. And then we have acceptance criteria: a button, another button, text box, and a mockup. Sure, that's an implementation and it would do what the story says, but the problem is that completely kills the creativity of a developer who will be implementing it. And in worst case scenario, when you provide implementation rather than giving some freedom to implement this, you may be implementing the wrong thing because those elements may not be suitable, or the realization may happen as you are developing that it doesn't make sense. So it's better to avoid technical details and be more more story driven than technical details driven. And here's an example what happened to me personally. A user story. There were two user stories, one to create a delete endpoint and another to create a put endpoint, essentially to delete a resource and to update it. But and for different sub resources, the intention was to add a bunch of those deletes and puts, which was okay and it would have worked, but it's simply not what we needed at the time. So when we refined the story from the point of view what a user wants, and a user wants removing or updating old accounts of a user with their data, and we don't care about the old stuff, we care about the new stuff. So the new stuff replaces old stuff. So when we came to this realization, we said, all this means that we want support overriding user data. So instead of a bunch of endpoints, a bunch of specific technical endpoints, it turned out to be just a single endpoint. But even then, we didn't say in the story acceptance criteria, create this endpoint. We said support overriding user data. And then developer came, saw that, and say, just one endpoint is enough. So I'll do that. Avoid technical stories because you may implement the wrong thing. I remember there was a discussion I had with a tester, and they said that they refine stories with Gherkin, with examples written in Gherkin language. Examples are great. Having them in stories, I think, is essential. But Gherkin is a programming language in the end. And if you refine stories with Gherkin, you risk, actually don't risk anything, but it's time consuming. Is Gherkin the most efficient format? Or is it something else? Gherkin is good, but when you are writing user stories, examples in Gherkin, acceptance criteria in Gherkin, you're spending more time, and maybe you're not spending as much time, but you're rushing writing those examples like as if you were to write feature tests in acceptance criteria. And it either is timely or it's a bit shallow, because you really should think how a story, like how those examples should be formulated if you want to put them in your tests. they need to be clear. And writing something clear documentation, clear examples takes time that you don't really have in story refinement. It's a separate process. In story refinement, we should focus on what we need to do, what problem are we solving and why, and not to write feature tests. So Gherkin is good, but it's suboptimal in user stories. So basically, when trying to come up with examples, try to make them as simple as you can. Short and sweet is the rule I go when creating examples in user stories. So in this case, the bolded text on the right is an acceptance criteria, an acceptance criteria, and the bottom part is bullet points of steps, what precondition you need, what you do, and what do you expect. Not Gherkin, but still examples, short and clear. So for example, the first one, if quantity is more than 1, and if I increment quantity, then the expectation is that the quantity got decremented. And it's totally fine to write this as other people are watching, as you're sharing your screen. It's fast, simple, and you don't even need to know Gherkin. You don't even need to be consistent, and so on. So if you don't like this format, come up with your own. It doesn't matter as much as long as you can do it fast. Write examples fast. And enough examples, but not too many, as in don't write redundant ones. So discovery is all about collaboration. And when we write examples in user stories, there is something that we can grasp as people, and it makes stories more interesting, down to earth. And as a person, you can get involved more easily. Now, instead of something abstract, vague, something theoretical, a story becomes something concrete if it has examples. So it definitely helps discovering the requirements that you haven't thought of, because it turns your imagination on. You start thinking like as a persona that the story is written to. And to make it happen, you need to have plenty of examples, but not too many. And to have plenty of examples, they should be minimalistic. And those examples are the baseline on which the rest of your tests will be written. So you better add them now rather than later, because you will need them anyways. And the key point here is that if you have examples, if you refine so well, you actually prevent bugs before even writing a test. So it's the most efficient, cost-wise way of developing software, because you can prevent bugs by giving examples even before code is written. So even before a test is written, actually. So tests written first are good because they prevent bugs before code is written, and examples before tests are good because they prevent bugs before a test is written. And now let's go to the second pillar, formulation. Basically, the art of writing tests, turning examples into tests. And unfortunately, this platform hides some of the things, how it's written. But I already mentioned this point. Readability is the first thing you should think about. So instead of words, keywords like item text box, you should use keywords like quantity, because it is what it is. It shouldn't be technical. So when you're writing feature tests, prefer readability. And it's really poor that the quality is like this, but so be it. In this example, I'll reference from my end. We talk about a specific item mentioned in a test scenario. So in this case, given a shopper has Samsung Galaxy phone in their shopping cart, and they change the quantity, you expect the shopping cart quantity to be changed. If they increment it, if it was 1 before, it should be 2 after. So the shopping cart specific item doesn't matter. So it should be, instead of Samsung Galaxy, it should be any product. And unfortunately, the slide has an effect to replace bad one with good one, and we cannot see it with this platform. Next example is about implicit state. Some things don't have to be mentioned in a test all over and over again. For example, if you have if you mention every time, given there is a specific item in a cart, given there is an item all over and over again, you can simply use a different keyword background to list the things that are common for all your scenarios. But without them, your scenario would still make sense as a reasonable example without that context that's implicit. So here is an example how that can be changed. In the background, you have shopping cart contains a product, and your scenario is given product quantity is at least 2. When OSHA decrements product quantity should be decremented. So instead of, and why is it good to have that shopping cart contains a product in the background? It's good because you'll have more than one scenario and you would be repeating otherwise shopping cart contains a product several times for every test scenario, which isn't great. So background helps with that because you can have implicit context. But I mean, implicit context is a context that you write somewhere. I don't recommend adding context that should be there in some precondition, in some test setup. If you don't mention it, you should not rely on it. So mention it at least in the background. If it's not mentioned even in the background, even though all scenarios need it, it's not great. So here I mention it not because it cannot work otherwise. I mention it here because it makes it clear. If you want to understand what details are there for every scenario, you can reference as documentation in the background if you scroll up. But if you're writing a test to which background is essential, and without reading that first background statement, you won't understand what the test does, then I highly recommend not writing a background and repeating it for every scenario, because it increases readability. So whether it increases readability or not is a difficult decision to make. It takes practice to develop a taste when reading tests. But when you have that, background may look like a good or bad idea depending on the context. And in this context, it saves us time to understand, but in our other contexts, it may prevent understandability. Why? Because if background is essential and the rest of scenario won't make sense without it, you will have to scroll up and down, up and down from the bottom scenario all the way to the background to start reading the test from the top and go to the scenario and continue. So avoid having long backgrounds and prefer not to have them at all if they don't increase readability. With feature tests, you can have parameterized tests in a table. And in Gherkin, it's called examples table. And how does it work? You can reference placeholders from examples table. So for example, if I have a column called duration and a column called cost, I can use a placeholder, and it's less an equal sign, which I can reference in my scenario. So you can see a given parking lot is economy and parking duration is this. When the cost estimate is calculated, then the parking cost should be that. And there are a bunch of scenarios, but something is wrong with these scenarios. What is wrong? There are too many of them. There are too many examples, because all of those examples include boundary conditions, but some of them, for example, 6 or 5, it doesn't really change anything. Actually, sorry, 6 and 5 are the same thing. 5 is like you are at your maximum cost for a day. So after 5 hours, you reach maximum parking cost. After 1 hour, you reach maximum parking cost for an hour. After 5 hours, you reach maximum parking cost for a day. So if it's 6 hours or 7, it doesn't change anything. So 24 hours illustrates that better than 6 hours. After 5 or 24 hours, you're still at 9 euros for cost. And again, are all examples needed? No, they're not. And this was supposed to illustrate the ones that are not needed. But the effect is a bit ruined, so I'll skip that and move on. And in this example, you see what is left, what only like critical examples we have left. And there is a trick. If you have just a duration and cost, it may not be very illustrative what you are trying to show with these examples. And Gherkin is a cool thing because you can add and invent your own things, like your own columns or keywords. So in this example, we used a column called description, which functionally doesn't do anything. So we can use a description to have documentation for our examples. So for the first example, 0 minutes, 0 cost, it means that a car wasn't parked at all. And that's what I say in description. And what is 30 minutes and 1 hour? It means that 2 euro is 1 hour cap. And why 1 hour? Why are we listing 1 hour in examples? It's the boundary value. It's the value after which the price will change. So we list boundary values, and we list values that showcase that indeed it doesn't change when it's within the boundary. So description helps us to clarify why is the cost that way after that time. Sometimes in a test, it may be difficult to spot a parameter. And in this case, what is parameter? Is it 1? And we have a test given 1 missing item and another one given 1 extra item. Is it 1 a parameter? And we go and see, actually, it's not 1 number, but 1 missing or 1 extra. 1 and what we do with that 1 is what makes a parameter in this scenario. It's not 2 parameters, it's 1 parameter. 1 missing is 1 parameter and 1 extra is another. So to emphasize that, we can do some tricks like put it in the end, the argument, or have it in quotes. Functionally, you can have it working just fine without any quotes using regex to bind, but logically, it will impact the testability, the readability, I'm sorry. If you're working with lots of text or JSON files, you can have multi-line expectations for strings, like a full JSON can be added as long as it's between triple quotes. So it supports that. And sometimes you're listing items, and I don't see a good example because it's a bit blurred with the effect not being rendered well. Sometimes you want to list items. For example, in a shopping cart, you have an inventory report, you have 1 damaged vase, 2 good crates of wine, and 2 Samsung TVs. So you can use this asterisk symbol instead of saying given inventory contains this, that, and that, and that. You can say given inventory contains, and then just use an asterisk and list the items. It contains 1 damaged vase, 2 good crates of wine, 2 Samsung TVs. Instead of saying and, you can just use asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And similar to and or but, in Gherkin, and or but have the same meaning. So if you have a positive action and a negative action, or something happened, something didn't happen, it's nice to put emphasis on the thing that did not happen with a but. So for example, and the thing was logged, but the entry wasn't created. If I say and the thing was locked and the entry wasn't created, you may read it and the entry was created, which is not the intention you wanted. So use a word but to put emphasis on the thing that didn't happen, or the opposite. Some scenarios represent a journey. And when you have many assertions in a scenario, you may say, oh no, it's bad, it's not how it's supposed to be, it's not good. But it's really not that bad, because it may illustrate a single typical flow of how your product is used. So use scenarios, a few scenarios, to illustrate a flow of how the product is used. So when you go to a home page, you should see these items. When you click this category, you should see these items. When you add item to a shopping list, it should appear in the shopping cart. When you go to the shopping cart, you should see that item. When you check out, it should be successful. One journey, many assertions, totally fine, but keep those journey scenarios to a few. So formulation increases readability, and when implementing examples, focus on readability, not just make it work, but make it readable. And if it's not readable, think what you can do about it. Use simple test data, and just because you add many examples doesn't mean you make it more tested. Those examples need to make sense and cover different business scenarios. And don't introduce details that matter. Like, don't add noise to your data. It needs to matter. If it's 1 + 1, 1 + 2, 1 + 3, it's really all the same addition of positive numbers. But if you add -1 + 0, -1 + 1, 1 + 1, that's a different thing, different logic. So add data that matters, add examples that matters. And some myths. BDD is expensive. It may be true, but only at the beginning. Later on, it gets faster and faster. So maybe for a sprint, you'll be slow, but in the second, third, fourth sprint, writing tests will be fast. And product owner, if product owner was to review feature files, they will spend actually less time because they would get less questions asked after refinements if they would review feature files. And product owners should not be writing feature files because they are not a programmer, not a tester, so they lack technique how to make them understandable. And if a product is developed, maybe that product is poorly understood, so you could use feature tests to increase understanding of such a product. And if a team is not very proficient with writing automated tests, BDD may not be a go-to for all cases. Maybe the team is absolutely against writing feature tests. So don't enforce it if the team is absolutely against it. And BDD is suitable everywhere where is complexity. So API may have complexity as well, and you should test that complexity using BDD as well. Don't use it for something like request validation. It's an overkill probably for BDD because you cover it with unit tests probably. But for complex, I don't know, registration logic, BDD is good, even testing an API. And some people say developers will create some framework using Gherkin language so that testers can use it, but it really shouldn't be a separation where developers create a framework and testers just use that framework. Use BDD for collaboration to combine testers and developers as one. That's very important. Don't isolate them by just creating a framework and further creating a distance between the two with a framework. Let them work together. So BDD is all about collaboration first and automated tests second. Use examples to make stories interesting and more understandable. Write scenarios with a pair of tester and developer. Do the feature tests and write examples before you write unit tests and other kind of tests. And treat those scenarios as documentation, make them readable. And if you have them automated, that will mean that your documentation will be in sync with code. Automated documentation and collaboration. That's what you get with BDD. And if you would like to learn more, here are a few reads. For books, really not much else to reference about BDD. And if you would like to see all the examples in code written, working, running within a project, you can see this demo link. And now some questions. So when the first one, when writing tests before feature implementation, doesn't that lead rewrite the test later as a feature changes, which leads to losing time during process? That is a risk. That may happen, but it's still better than not doing it, because if you do it, you can verify it very early on that your thing works. You will know that it works end to end right after you finished it, rather than some days or even worse, weeks or even worse, months later. So the risk of changing it is there, but the benefit pays off. And the benefit, you will know immediately whether what you did is working or not. Another question, is there good advice about keeping background short, but how do I manage this when you need 10 steps for data setup? What is the best approach to handle more complex scenarios? Great question. So is everything in the background absolutely essential for the scenario you're writing? If it's not, then those things can be in test setup. It doesn't have to be in the background if it's not important for those scenarios. If those scenarios rely on something, but that something is obvious and doesn't need to be explicitly written, then don't mention it in the background.
There's one last question before we go to the lunch break. So, in your opinion, what are the main difficulties when implementing a BDD approach in teams?
I think the main difficulty may be that the team may say it's a necessary overhead because you will need to write those feature files, and then you will need to write glue code that binds to it. So it may sound like you need to write not just automation code, but also the feature file itself. Like, so two things instead of one thing. And proving the benefit of why we need a feature file may come as a challenge. So you should remind them that it's all about documenting the understanding from developer and tester onto a feature file, and having that as an artifact isn't just for testing, it's for collaborating, it's for increasing understanding. So it's just another benefit and byproduct that you want to have anyways with BDD. So proving that is essential, that it's not just a different way of writing tests and a different syntax, but it's a different approach to it altogether to increase collaboration. So proving that is difficult, but if you manage, that should prove a point and you should do it.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting insights to BDD and the impact on the work you can have. So for the rest of you, we have now lunch break. See you soon in about 1 hour. And yeah, enjoy and rest a little bit. Thank you.